It's been 2 years since I last had the opportunity to be in the company of those who are discovering the secrets of a life worth living. They'll have to share those with me afterwards, because I feel like each iteration of the class comes up with a kind of a new recension of ideas and approaches. And I think the beautiful thing about the space that you're in, and actually really the unique thing about the space that you're in, I kind of, I'm turning 50 in 2 weeks. And so it's like this moment of reckoning, right? I'm entering the last trimester of my life before I'm birthed into eternity. And so, it's in the last trimester, things go really wrong. And so I know because my son was born from C-section. So I've been thinking a lot about what this time means for me. And I think the questions that you are asking about a life worth living are not only evergreen, but ever present. I think they follow us, or they're with us the moment that we're born. But I would suggest that if we look into the Islamic tradition, that they're with us at the very moment at which our souls are brought forth into existence. And the Qur'an has this kind of beautiful, dramatic story that it tells about the creation of the souls. We're told that in the time before time itself, which in Islamic theology is considered a creation of God, that in that timeless time when there is only the Creator, that each and every soul that is to be brought into existence is brought into existence in soul form. And all the souls that are to come into the temporal created world are brought before the presence of the created, majestic, and beautiful divine. And the Quran tells us that all of us, all of our souls are asked, Alastu bi rabbikum. Alastu bi rabbikum means, am I not your Lord? And it's a question, but it's a question whose answer is obvious, because the souls themselves are experiencing the beginnings of this thing called life and identity for the first time. And they are in full knowledge and full awareness that it is this beautiful, majestic, creative, divine presence that has even brought them into some form of soul sentience. And so the Quran tells us, Qalu, they responded, Bala. The Quran could have used a whole bunch of language, because the Arabic for yes is na'am. But no, that's not what the language the Quran uses. The Quran says, Qalu, they said, Bala, absolutely, without doubt, you are our Lord. Right? Qalu, Bala, shahidna. Not even that we witness it, but it is in the past present tense, which the Arabic and other Semitic languages love. We have witnessed it. And that means we are in a state of witnessing. We have witnessed, and we will continue to witness. Why is that so important for this question of a life worth living? The Sufis say that on that day, there was a music that emanated from the souls, that in the symphony, in the choir of souls, that as they all responded, Qalu Bala Shahidna, as they responded, yes, verily, absolutely, we have witnessed this, there was a particular music. And the Sufi poets called it the music of Alast, the music of the day of affirmation. And it said that on that day, that music, that resonance was encoded in our souls. And that our separation from the community of souls to follow our trajectory into the temporal realm at different points in created history, that each one of us had a part of that symphony, a note in that symphony. But we're separated from all the other notes until we come into this world and we start to meet each other. We start to engage with humanity. So the Sufis would often say that there are those moments, and you know that moment, I know that moment because we've all experienced it. There's that moment when we meet someone for the first time And after a few minutes, we say, it's like I've known you my entire life. Have we met before? Was it last year that no, we never seen each other. We don't know each other. But there's something, right? There's a resonance. People talk about that as soulmates. They'll meet their soulmate and say, it's like I've known them all their lives. The truth of the matter is that the Sufis would say that when you meet someone and you feel an immediate resonance with them, know that they're a soul that was close to you on the day of Alast. Both of you are hearing the same music. Both of you are feeling the same soul resonance. And now in this life, you're kind of connecting with each other and meeting with each other. And why is that important? It's important because what we recognize, I think, in the Islamic tradition about a life worth living, about going through this temporal created existence in a way that is meaningful not only to the completion of our own humanity, but also to our higher aspiration as to who we are in the world and what we need to do here, is that the idea is that this soul, this thing that we call the soul, is, as the Qur'an said, min amru rabbi, it's from God, that there's part of the divine that's in us. And Rumi would talk about that, the Rumi that has become the most popular poet in the Americas through translation. Because Rumi begins his magnum opus, the Masnawi, his great commentary on the Qur'an, really, and talks about us it says to us to consider, rather, the reed flute. Now, for those of you who are from traditions where the ney is played, the reed flute is played, you know that it has a very specific sound. It's a mournful sound. It's almost like it's like a wail. And in the hands of a masterful player, when a masterful player plays the ney, she's able to invoke these kind of really deep, melancholic emotions of longing and sadness and grief and connection. And Rumi reflected on this. He said, consider the reed flute that's been snipped from the reed bed. See how it mourns so wailingly and with such grief. That's the condition of the human being. Always desiring a return to the reed bed. That is only in the cutting from the reed bed that it makes this noise and makes this sound. And if it's reconnected to that reed bed, to the divine origin from which it came, the beautiful divine origin that it's attested to on that day where the soul's attested to the creativity, the magnificence, and the beauty of God, then it will be whole. And so this idea is that the life worth living is a journey towards what? Wholeness. Reconnection. It is a journey through sadness. It is indeed a journey through grief. It is a journey through trauma. But it is also a journey through joy and of beauty and of connection and of love. Lost and won again and lost again. All of those things become meaningful because the journey of the soul is towards reconnection with the divine. At the heart of it, in that connection back to the divine, what is the human being seeking? What are we seeking? And what does the Islamic tradition say that we're seeking? My friends call me AR, which you're welcome to do. But my full name is Abdul-Rehman, which means servant or slave of the merciful one. Rahman is one of the canonical attributes of God, often referred to as the names of God in the Islamic tradition. But essentially, they're attributes. They're ways for us to understand God. They're ways in which we're able to access the eternality and the magnificence of the divine. And so, in our culture, some from South Asian, I'm Punjabi. My family came from the Indian side of Punjab to the Pakistan side of Punjab in 1947 as refugees. They established themselves in a new land, never went back to the country of their birth or their origin. I've never been able to go back to the Indian side of Punjab. Being a refugee and being an immigrant has been an essential part of my character. Bad news in Trump's America. But it's part of my character. It's part of who I am. It's part of my identity. I can't change that. Everything who I am is because of people who moved, were forced to move, or compelled to move, have moved again. They often say, Salman Rushdie, the British, Pakistani, erstwhile Muslim writer, would often speak about the curse of the migrant. He said the curse of the migrant is as Daniel Defoe, the author, wrote, is the curse of the devil, to never step in the same place twice. That the curse of the devil is to always be hopping and moving and never be settled. It's the curse of the migrant is to be hopping and moving and never be settled, always looking for home. I would say that's our condition. Rumi would say that's the human condition, that we're never settled. We're never at home until we connect with the divine. And so I was born in 1975, and it was right in the middle of lots of wars and crises, the OPEC crises, middle of a recession, and the Holy Land was blowing up. The civil war in Lebanon had began. It was, it was pretty terrible. Not unlike today. And my parents decided that they only had one name for me. Usually naming in our family is a big deal. The grandparents have to be called. And in those days, you couldn't pick up the phone and call. You had to book a call. Growing up, Matt, there was this time where you had to book calls. So you literally had to call the operator and say, I'm booking a call to Pakistan. And then they would call you back and you say your call has been booked. And then you hope to God that someone's on the other end to receive your call. And that's why people made schedules. Then every Thursday night at such and such time, we're going to book a call, or once a month. But calls were expensive. A 3-minute call was 20 or 25 Canadian dollars. That was a lot of money for my parents. And so they didn't even book a call when I was born, They just gave me the name Abdul-Rehman. And when I asked them about it years later, they told me, my late mother, God bless her soul, would say that, we felt that in a time of manifest crisis, war, and tragedy, that we wanted our firstborn son, or at least at that time, the only child, to be connected to God's mercy. And so they said they gave you the name Abdul-Rehman. Fast forward to 2011, and my son was born, and my partner and I had already decided that we too would name him Abdul-Rehman, because I realized if my parents had that thinking back in 75, it behooved me in 2011 to do exactly the same. He's not AR Jr., but he stands as Abdul-Rehman in his own right, because I too, when I'm no longer here and it's him, that I want him to have some remembrance of this connection to God's mercy in a time that's manifestly unmerciful. And so mercy is the term that is most often used in the Qur'an to describe God. The name Rahman, or the merciful one, or Rahim, the compassionate one, are the attributes that God refers to God's self the most amount of times in the text of the Quran. And so in some ways, mercy, rahma, is the emblematic character of the Islamic tradition. Why is this important to what we started off with? Is that if we're seeking reconnection to the divine, and that's the process of living a life that's worth living, is to connect ourselves to the wholeness of ourselves, which is achieved through connection to the source, then how do we best do that? Through what attributes, through what actions in the world do we best do that? And the actions in the world that we best do that through are by engaging with and exemplifying God's mercy. That it's said that when the Prophet Muhammad, on his famous journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem through the seven heavens to an experience of the divine known as the Isra and the Mi'raj, the Prophet said, gazing upon the emblematic throne of God, that God wrote upon God's throne, that I placed my mercy above my judgment. That God's mercy becomes then the animating attribute of the universe. In one famous statement in which the Prophet utters the words of God, called the Hadith Qudsi, or these sacred narrations, not Qur'an, but rather almost inspirational moments where the Prophet speaks in the voice of God. He says that God said that I was a treasure that longed to be known, and so that I created creation in order to be known. that the mercy of God is encapsulated in the desire for us to know the beauty and the majesty of the Creator. And so this connection to mercy means that the question that we end up asking ourselves as believers is how are we merciful? How are we merciful in the world? And what is it that we are doing to create systems, methods, ways of living and being with ourselves, our families, and those around us that exemplify mercy? And how do we exemplify mercy in a time that is manifestly mean, that is manifestly unmerciful, that's manifestly aggressive, that is manifestly deadly, that is manifestly unequal, unjust, when the very systems that surround us don't facilitate mercy, compassion, or justice, but actually facilitate the exact opposite of those things: exploitation, power. The very institutions that we sit in do that. And so for the believer, this is a dilemma, because everything is pulling the exact opposite way. The way that we organize our societies are organized in an exact opposite way to facilitating mercy and compassion and justice. And so therefore, this idea that we want to engage in a life worth living, from where I stand, is probably the most difficult question that we'll ever ask ourselves. Because, frankly, it's easy at some level to give in. I don't think it's like easy and you don't have to work hard. And you can work hard and you can get there. There's lots of measures of successes. The school is very good at teaching them. Schools like this are very good at teaching them. This is not a knock against our school. This is just the systems that we live in. And yet, folks like Matt and Drew and a whole bunch of other amazing people have created a space like this, where, for a few weeks throughout the course of a year, we kind of kick ourselves out of our ennui and sort of ask ourselves these difficult questions about what it means to live a life worth living. And I think all of you must have recognized by now, I think I certainly have, that to live a life worth living is bloody hard work. And while a lot of it feels natural and real and in tune with our essential selves, we realize that not only that so much is pulling against it, but we have so much unpacking to do of the lessons and ways that we are in the world. What does it mean to be merciful? The Prophet Muhammad said, "Can I tell you something that's better than prayer and fasting?" Now, for the Muslim, when they listen to this, they really pay attention. So I just want you to put yourself in a Muslim's shoes for a second. Since prayer and fasting are the 5 pillars, if you don't fast or pray, there's some Muslims who say that you're not Muslim at all. So the Prophet says, what is better than prayer and fasting? And the believing Muslim says, what's the Prophet talking about? Because there's nothing better than prayer and fasting. That's the base of the whole religion. But the Prophet says, what's better than prayer and fasting? Right? Is to love one another and repair relationships between you and others. There's a whole set of narrations in the literature, the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad, who say, I tell you what's better than prayer and fasting. Is to ensure that your belly is not full while your neighbor's belly is empty. So at the heart of mercy is a reflexive and relational quality, right? We can't be empathetic. We can't be empathetic to ourselves. That's real self-help talk. I'm not against it. But at some point, if you're empathetic to yourself, and be graceful and merciful with yourself, then that naturally there's a reflexive quality to it. And the reflexive quality is if I'm practicing empathy and self-care with myself, then I'm obviously doing that with somebody else. Then I'm doing with the folks around me. And so I would say that at the heart of this question of the life worth living, and if mercy is the operating emblematic principle in the Islamic tradition of living that life worth living, then it has to be reflexive and relational. That we are, by our divine nature, social beings, carrying around the music of the day of Alast, seeking out soul connection, and practicing that mercy in the world. But alongside that, and this is where, I'll wrap up on this, and then we can just open up to conversation, is that alongside that comes a secondary, not a secondary, but I would say equivalent sort of calling. And that calling really is to justice. Because the Qur'an speaks about God as a Ghafoor and Rahim, so he's as the forgiving and the merciful. But God also speaks about God's self as being just. And the Qur'an, in instructing the believer and the prophet who is receiving this revelation, says, be just, even if it is against yourselves, or those who are close to you, your parents, your kinfolk. That justice is such a high calling that even if it's against your own people, your own tribe, your own faith, your own family, your own friends, be just, even if it's against your own selves. So Islam is often talked about a religion of radical monotheism. That's why when it comes to like I teach at the divinity school, so I always tell my Christian students, I'm always like I have a real love and appreciation for Christian theology. And they say, oh, AR, why is that? I said, because Christian theology is really hard. To get from 3 to 1. I mean, that's a kind of a mathematical impossibility. But somehow you do it. There's a lot of spiritual calisthenics involved, a lot of acrobatics you have to do. You got to bring in philosophy. You got to bring now quantum physics, the quantum physics of the Trinity. You got to bring that all in. And along the way, you've produced this beautiful tapestry of theology, which I so love to learn and engage with, because there's so much wisdom and truth and beauty there. From Muslims, it's like, okay, we got this sorted. One God, radical monotheism, there's nothing unlike him. That's our North Star. Anytime things get murky, you just look up in the sky and you're like, I see my North Star. Divine unity, okay, let's head in that direction. When my students get lost in Islamic philosophy or theology or Sufism, and they're like lost in the terminology, I say, stop, drop, and roll. No, I don't say that. I say, stop. And I say, just look, and where's your North Star? Radical monotheism, Tawheed. Just look up, you got it. Okay, now how does that principle impact what you're reading? And often they'll find that a way of doing it. It's something that, it's a conversation between our religious traditions. So Islam has this idea of radical monotheism. But we also have this idea of radical accountability, which is why so much of the Qur'an is focused on the eventual judgment that's coming to each and every one of us. That each and every one of us has the agency to act in the world, and therefore we will be radically responsible for everything that we do. So along with this radical monotheism comes a radical responsibility. And therefore this question of mercy and justice for the believing Muslim become really important. Because if you're not behaving mercifully, relationally in the world, and you're not being just to yourself and to others and calling yourself and others to justice, then you are not fulfilling that radical responsibility. Now that's a high calling, and we're going to fall short. It's a high calling and we're going to fail. Doesn't mean you're human being. Doesn't mean we don't try. We don't aspire. That's the whole point. The whole point is that the believer asks God and says, oh God, make me a means, a vessel through which your mercy and compassion and justice flow. Allow my agency to be used to be merciful in the world, compassionate in the world, but also just in the world. And sometimes, especially in the times that we live in, to be both merciful and just is really hard. How do you stand up against aggression and violence in a just and merciful way? That's tough. And yes, that's the ask. The ask is, can we be merciful and acknowledge a shared humanity and yet be just and acknowledge violence and aggression and manifest injustice? Can we meet oppression with mercy and justice? I think those are the big questions about that we're living through right now. In this country, elsewhere. That's such a big question. That's the reality right now. And God knows best, but I think it's just going to be the reality we're going to live. My son's 14 years old. If war and mass death don't get his generation first, the heat will kill us. That's the truth. It's not to be that's to be desperate or to despair, but to really look at the human condition right now with like clarity. And you're at a really interesting point, right, in your own lives and your own personal trajectories in terms of dealing with that. And in a way, the fact that all of you have ended up into the space of the life worth living, is actually really telling about the questions that you're asking. And I think that's profound. And I would love to see where these conversations take you in your own personal trajectories and where you end up. I want to finish off with sharing a prayer. In the Islamic tradition, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there's a kind of a number of sort of critical moments. And I think amongst the most devastating and among the most sort of heart-wrenching is the martyrdom and the murder of the Prophet's grandson, Hussein, on the fields of Karbala in modern-day Iraq. There was internecine conflict between Muslim powers. And so Hussein, who was the beloved grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, about whom the Prophet said, I am from Hussein and Hussein is from me, Hussein led an army against Yazid, the Umayyad Caliph, who had kind of viciously taken the throne, but also usurped the authority of the family of the Prophet, who enjoyed great support amongst believers. The son of Imam Hussein, who lived and survived the massacre of Karbala, where Imam Hussein was beheaded and his head was paraded in the streets of Baghdad and Kufa. Kind of a horrible moment in early Islamic history. No religion actually should have survived that. Muslims consider it a miracle that Islam still existed. The son of Imam Hussein became known as a great spiritual master, and his name was Zain al-Abidin. And this prayer is important to me because I named my son Abdul-Rehman Ali Zain al-Abidin after the grandson of Imam Hussein. And he said in this famous prayer of the perfection of character, the prayer for the perfection of character, he said, "O God, make me love those who bear ill will towards me. Grant me an open hand to those who wrong me. Let me be a source of healing where there's hurt, of justice where there's oppression, and of light where there is darkness." And I really love that prayer because I think it holds the contradictions of the human condition together and makes that appeal to reconnection that we started off this short conversation with. That in our seeking of connection and reconnection to God, wholeness, that the hard work of mercy, justice, love, that's going to be not just the mood music, that's going to be just the material step of that journey. And that's what the faith calls us to. And certainly from where I sit right now in 2025, on the cusp of my last trimester of life, I certainly feel that if I could follow that would be a life worth living.
So one thing I'd love to hear a bit more about is your understanding of justice. So we were talking a little bit about this in our seminar today, the sort of balance of justice and mercy. So I'm really glad you brought it up. And I feel like I have more of a sense of what mercy means in this sort of sense and in the Quran. But justice is really tough. And this is something that I find tough in Tanakh and Christian Bible as well. And sort of a lot of ancient texts, like how we conceive of justice, it seems relative to a lot of social circumstances.
Yeah.
So, it was really helpful.
No, I appreciate that. So I teach a class up in the div school called Islam at the Intersections, Readings in Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Liberation, where we really take a deep dive into formulations of Islamic theology that center justice, liberation, Black and racial experiences, feminist and womanist experiences, and queer experiences. And the question of justice comes up often. I like to kind of go to this work of Ramon Harvey. Ramon Harvey wrote this really interesting book, Towards a Just Society, where he looks at the Quranic language around justice. And it's a beautiful text. A bit dense, but I think it really gives a lot as you kind of try to work through it, because he actually starts to define and really sort of unpack the Quranic language around what are the words. And so he has a very interesting separation between this idea of adl, which is often translated as justice, and qist, which is also translated as justice. Adl is a kind of, because good God is al-adil, the just, is a kind of almost perfect justice, right? Of a perfect balance, equality, in the sense of everything being in the place that it's supposed to be, in the way that it's supposed to be. Balance, mizan, is a motif in the Quran and in the Hadith and the classical literature, that balance. Or wasat, this idea of being a middle ground. You are a din al-wusta, a middle nation created between extremes. And of course, this is part of the Quranic critique of Christianity and Judaism, of an adherence to law and an adherence to unfettered love and salvation, right? That what is required is belief in the ultimate sacrifice of the Son of God, and what is required is a belief in the law. We're one in the middle. And so the Quran often sets itself up, not in opposition to, but in balance between those two things. That's what I would call justice. But this is something really interesting. The Quran talks about it a lot, and that's relational justice. I have to be doing right by you, and you doing right by me. So what does that look like in society? How do we deal with each other and treat each other in our economics and our politics and our spirituality? How do we cede space and create space for one another? And how do we treat one another with ultimate fairness? And so ideas of equality and fairness emerge out of the idea of qist. Now, for the progressive discourse in Islam, this creates all kinds of things. What about laws that are gender unequal, right? What about laws that are unequal between faith communities? And so this becomes an active kind of, for modern theologians like Farid Isaac, for instance, or Amina Wadud, these become like really animating issues, right? How do we achieve justice when at times our own tradition exemplifies inequality or to some injustice? And so I think for me, that begins to kind of enter into the mechanics of justice. And also this notion that Al-Adil, God, is so perfectly just that none of us on that day of judgment, where our radical accountability will come face to face with the radical accountant, is that never will we be in loss for good or khair that we have done in the world, and also that we'll be accountable for ill will. Can I add a dimension to that maybe even complicates it further? God constantly says in the Quran that I am forgiving and merciful. In one very emotive passage of the Quran, God says, he said, Qul ya ibadi, the one who worships me. God is speaking in a very intimate way to the creation. It says, I speak to the one who worships me. He says, do you despair of the mercy of God for the zulm, for the oppression that you have done to yourselves? know that the mercy of God is close and was never far away. The Sufis and the spiritual masters, both women and men within the Islamic tradition, will say that the most powerful observation of a Muslim beyond the canonical pillars, which are exactly that, foundational, but they're not the house. The house of Islam really is built on this constant recognition of God, and so we are asked God for forgiveness. And that we say God is closer to us than our jugular veins, that God is never absent from us, that our very reality in the theological way is contingent on the divine gaze. So the presence of the divine in the Islamic tradition, there's no deus ex machina in the Islamic tradition, that God is very present. And so this idea of like asking forgiveness and reaching out, it's just like it's right there. Why does the human being find that so difficult? Our own arrogance, our own ego. It's said that on the last day, there's a really famous kind of, you can almost say, spiritual vision that the Prophet Muhammad sees. And he says that the Prophet Muhammad was sitting with his companions, and all of a sudden he started to smile and laugh. And they said, "Oh, messenger of God, why do you laugh?" He says, "I've just seen a scene from the Day of Judgment in this spiritual unveiling." He says, "I've seen two people come before God and they're being judged. And that one is complaining about the other and saying that this person slandered me and this person hurt me and this person stole from me." And God acknowledges that indeed that is what this person did. He says, "I am capable of forgiving any sins that you have done to yourself. But on this day, you must have restitution between yourselves." And so God asks the one who's been wronged, "What do you want?" He says, "I want all of his good deeds. I want all of his khair. I want all of his goodness. I want to drain his account." And so God says, "Okay." And then the prophet starts to cry. And he starts crying. He says, "What a mighty day that will be when we will be held account for the hurt that we have caused one another." And then the story continues. It's a beautiful story. The story continues, and God says to the one who has now received restitution on this final day of judgment, and he says to him, look up, and what do you see before you?" And he sees this wondrous scene of beauty and jewels and nature and gardens. The most beautiful scene that one could imagine. So the person the wronged one who has now been given restitution says, "Oh God, who is this all for?" God says, "It's for you." He says, "How?" He says, "I'm not deserving of all this." He said, "Forgive your fellow person. Forgive the one who wronged you. And all this and more belongs to you." And so he says, "God, I forgive him for everything." And then the prophet says to his companions, he says, "Forgive one another. Make peace with one another. Do justice to each other now. Because on that day, it'll be too great. The injustice you've done to each other will be too great." And so all to say is that part of justice is the relational as well. Part of it, and it's operated in a relational way. And that's why I think when Muslims often talk about justice and social justice within this contemporary context, it is at the heart of it relational. And so the idea that we are enacting, or we are, that the attribute of justice is acting through us, means that we are acting justly in the world. And of course, that idea of qist, relational justice, has many levels. It's human, but it's also justice with nature. The prophet said, "Walk upon the earth gently, because the earth is your mother." This idea, this very indigenous idea that we've come to know, also appears in this kind of Semitic religious idea of the earth being personified in a motherly way out of something that gives life. Yeah, I hope that begins to it's kind of weighted out. But I think you're absolutely right. I think justice often can be a bit more murky, easy to refer to, more difficult to define.
Yeah, it's easy to just assume a sense of like justice as punishment, which is lacking in so many ways.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. Yes, absolutely.
Maybe you could talk more about how to reconcile the idea of radical accountability with the idea of nothing really being meaningful except through God, and how God is everything that is, He is all strength and all light. And how we can kind of embrace both of those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of I think theological quagmires that monotheistic folk come across. And part of that is, God's omniscience and omnipotence, and I think we reach that. And in a way, that's how have I reconciled that? Now I'll get to your question. It's a really good one. Part of me is that I remember the first time that I think the first time I skirted with denial of the divine. I wouldn't call it atheism, but I think questioning God. It was actually right after I went to Mecca for the first time. I'd just gone to Mecca. I was maybe, how old was I? I was 14. Yeah, I think I was 14. 15 years old. And I remember it was a really overwhelming experience. And the Karbala in Mecca, the pilgrims, it's overwhelming. And I was with my grandfather and my grandmother from Pakistan, it was my family, it was a lot. And I remember being struck the days afterwards that we were in Jeddah visiting friends by this real sense of oh God, if you are present, know everything, what's it all worth? Where's my agency in all this? Mine just sound like a pawn in this kind of divine chess game being moved around. And it was really hard. It was the first time that I kind of reckoned with it. And of course, we all go there. You don't have to be religious. You have to study mathematics, the eternality of numbers. Modern physics teach us about eternal multiverses. What does that mean for us? What does it mean when we die? Something happens. You don't have to believe in the soul to know that your energy and matter doesn't get destroyed. It just changes form. We're looking at this kind of reality now where it's almost like the religious language has become the language of physics. All to say is I think these are bigger existential questions. And I think we do contend with that, right? And part of that is Dr. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, says that there's a point where you learn all the science and everything, you come up to the precipice. You come up to the end of questions. And that's where faith begins. And I think in terms of this idea of accountability, for me, the idea of accountability is really human. It is this divine gift. Whatever it is agency is divine gift. Accountability is divine gift. Then I am given agency and I'm held to account for what I do, which makes my life really valuable. I think it's really easy. I think there's this thing, there's two things that can happen when we look out into the eternal universe. I'm a speck of a speck of a speck. I mean, the earth is like a grain of sand of the universe. What does it all mean? And yet we're here, we're sentient. We create civilization, we hurt one another, we create glory and beauty and death and destruction in equal measure. And yet we're so tiny in the grand scheme of things. The Islamic tradition, particularly because of the story of the Day of Allah, teaches us that we're created with value and purpose. Each and every one of us has a story, a remarkable trajectory. We are the genetic makeup of generations, and yet we are ourselves. And that's something powerful and beautiful and also edifying. That the human being is an amazing thing. And along with that comes this, in the Islamic tradition, a necessity to recognize that we must be in the world in a way that is conscious of our place in it with one another, but also with nature and the environment. And the systems that we create are the ones that support our collective humanity, or they don't. And I think that's where the idea of accountability and agency and divine come from. And that whatever it is that what we are seeking to kind of exemplify is the best way to be. And of course, we'll fail. That's the heart of it. There is this idea that we will fail. There are moments I think we'll succeed. But I think there are also moments that we'll fail. But that's part of it, isn't it? That's part of the nature of this tension of creation destruction, of building and things falling down. And I think every generation goes through it. Our hope was always that the trajectory is like this. Abrahamic faiths aren't very good at that. We're kind of entropic at some level. There's this kind of inevitable decline, but we don't live that, do we? We live in the moment. So even in moments of decline, we try to seek hope. And you know, one of the most powerful things that I've been focusing on in these days of like all kinds of heartache and heartbreak is that the Prophet Muhammad said that even if the day of judgment was coming upon you and you have a sapling, plant it. Because it isn't about the results of our actions, it's doing the right thing. It's acting in a way that cultivates and nurtures and builds. And that's what faith is asking us to do, for me. And I turn to that a lot when I feel despair.